In this lecture, we're going to be moving into the next big part of the course, which is the Protestant Reformation, which will be in for a number of lectures. And we're going to see a lot of similarities between the Reformation and the period we just finished, the Renaissance. Because like the Renaissance, the Reformation was a search for renewal and revival. In this case, however, it was a search for a renewal of religion and the church, religious life. So it has some very definite similarities. We're going to see today in this lecture that religious life and the church structure and the church itself in the late Middle Ages had some really serious problems that needed to be addressed. And it should be pointed out, these problems weren't new. They'd been around since at least the Central Middle Ages, but they'd become worse in the 14th century, and really by the time we reached the 1500s, that there needs to be something to be done about them. Reformers come along, Luther, and you'll see many others, who have many different answers to these problems. But one of the major answers is also similar to Renaissance humanism, and that is the Reformers wanted to reject the medieval church as a kind of corrupt church and return to what they called the apostolic church, which was the church of Christ and the apostles as it was first set up, in the very early days of the church, because they imagined that the apostolic church was pure and without any corruptions, and all you had to do was go back to that, and you could solve all the problems in the present church. So that's kind of like the humanist notion of going back to antiquity. However, the Reformation doesn't end with the goals it started out shooting for. The Reformation starts out trying to make the church better, to reform the church, to improve the church, to clean up the church's problems. And in the end, what happens is it shatters the church into many different competing churches and sects and groups. So whereas before you had just one church with basically one message, after the Reformation, during and after the Reformation, you get many different churches, many different messages, many different voices, and a kind of chaos and confusion on the religious front. So we'll see all that happening in the next number of lectures. Another thing we're going to see happening is that the Reformation marks a basic change in church-state relations in Europe. Since the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had pretty much maintained a separation of church and state. The papacy had managed to remain independent, to run the church, and not to fall under the domination of secular rulers, at least since the 11th century investiture crisis. During the Reformation, that separation of church and state pretty much comes to an end, and secular states, nation states, begin to take control over the church at various different churches, and the churches lose their independence. So we'll see all that going on and a lot more in the next number of lectures. What we're going to be talking about primarily in this lecture are some of the problems the church had and some of the possible solutions to those problems leading up to the Reformation period. Like I said, these problems weren't particularly new, but they were becoming more serious almost day by day. We'll start out with a really big problem the church had, and that was during the 14th century, the church had essentially lost its credibility as a spiritual leader for the people. It had lost its spiritual leadership. And this is going to take us to something we've mentioned briefly before, the rise of popular piety. Now, a long time ago in Reformation studies, historians used to say, well, in the era before the Reformation, people were kind of getting less religious, and that's why the Reformation was able to happen. But we know now, there's overwhelming evidence that in the 14th and 15th centuries, there was in fact a huge increase in religious enthusiasm among the people, the common people of Europe. Interestingly enough, right along with a wave of anti-clericalism because of the papal fiscalism and the Babylonian captivity and so forth. So the period right before the Reformation is an exceedingly religious period. And the reason for this is It was a reaction to the plague and the depression and the wars and the chaos. People simply needed comfort and guidance from the church during this terrible time in the 14th century. They needed to feel like their religion could protect them. And so they sought to become involved in their religion. They sought a religion of emotion. They wanted to feel involved with God. They wanted to feel security from God. They wanted to feel closeness to God. And they tried to do all these things through religious life. They were essentially looking for protection in this terrible period, and they thought that the church should be able to provide it, and that, God through the church would provide this protection. So people are looking for security and for closeness to God. They're essentially crying out in spiritual need. And unfortunately, the church was not in a position to offer much help, because the church was going through its own terrible crises. The Babylonian captivity, the Great Schism, all sorts of other problems, and the church just failed to respond. And as a result of that, as we saw in the last lecture, we're going to see more today, the people began to take it upon themselves to create a religious life that would satisfy their needs. And this is what we call popular piety. Some of the things that popular piety involves were religious practices that had been around for quite a long time, but just became a lot more popular in this period, and others were new things. Among the former things that had been around for a while, religious confraternities, essentially religious clubs in cities, had been around since the Middle Ages, been a very important social institution since the Middle Ages, but they become a lot more popular now. More people are joining, more of them are created. People are associating for religion a lot more. Another thing that had been around but becomes more popular is veneration of saints and veneration of relics. Nothing new, but now wildly more popular in the church. Even more saints begin to appear, and the veneration of saints becomes very, very prevalent. The church begins to sell more indulgences, ironically enough, which is one of the things that kicks off the Reformation, but there was a demand among the people for indulgences as well. Pilgrimages, where a pious person would make a trip to a holy site, like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, or even Jerusalem. I mean, pilgrimages become more popular. Passion plays become more popular. But also new things are being formed. And these new things are really the people's original contribution to their religious life. For example, we mentioned in the last lecture the rosary beads. I'll just briefly mention that again. Rosary beads were an attempt by people to feel involved in their religion. When they had gone to Mass and just stood there in the nave of the church and just heard the Mass in Latin and not really understood it, they felt rather left out of the whole religious experience. With the rosary necklace, they could move the beads, they could count the number of prayers they were saying to the Virgin Mary, they could be in contact with religion and with God, and they could feel it in their own hands, something that was very tangible, and it was important to them, and they felt like now they were getting something done. Now they were a part of the religious experience. So that's one example. Another great example is the Stations of the Cross, which was something usually focused on the Easter week. And it was a kind of practice based on Christ's passion. And what they would do is they would set in the church a number of paintings of Christ at different parts of his trip to be crucified, different parts of his passion, different parts of his suffering and crucifixion, being taken down from the cross and all that. And then people would go around to each painting, they would kneel down at the painting, they would look at it, and they would say prayers. And the paintings were very expressive. I mean, in every picture, the expression on Christ's face and the other people's faces were very human and very compelling. And when people looked at these pictures, they felt like, well, I really understand what's happening. I know that emotion because I felt that. And they felt like they were a part of Christ's passion that way. So they're internalizing their religion. They're getting into religion. Another not terribly new thing, but thing that becomes much more popular now is the cult of Mary, veneration of Mary. Because people could identify with Mary since she was a mother, like women were mothers. They could see her emotions, and they could really get involved with her whole experience in religion, and that again connected them to their religious life. A big part of popular piety was tangible objects, things like relics, which you could actually see. Usually you couldn't touch them, but you could see them. They were there, they were real. They were some holy object like a finger bone of an apostle, or a hair from an apostle, or a piece of the true cross, something like that. And they felt like they were getting close to a real part of God, a real part of religion. This was a real thing, and it was there, and they were there. So that became really, really a lot more popular. But the thing that concerns us the most here is just to notice that this religious experience, this religious life is developing apart from the official church. And that is very important. Popular piety and all this upsurge in religious enthusiasm and all these new practices are being invented by the people, not by the church. And it's developing totally apart from the official church. In some cases, the practices actually deviated from official church practice. And, you might think that would cause some trouble with the church, because kind of like the popular notion of the medieval church is it was very strict and intolerant and all that. But in fact, it wasn't. The medieval church was quite tolerant of small deviations in practice and even in belief, as long as those small deviations didn't strike at the institutional power base of the church, which was the sacramental system. Now later on, Luther strikes at that hard, but these popular piety practices really don't. So the church sees really no harm in them, and the church wants to be inclusive. It wants to have a very broad tent. It wants to bring everybody in. It doesn't want to alienate and push people out. And so for that reason, the church is fairly broad-minded and tolerant, and the people are allowed to develop these practices on their own and practice them on their own. In a lot of cases, the church even adopts these practices officially and makes them, part of the official church, but it only does so very slowly. The lag time is sometimes as much as 100 years before a popular practice would be adopted as an official church practice. But before that, it was certainly tolerated, and it was really a practical part of people's religious experience. It's a bad sign, however, when the church has become a religious follower of the people. And that's exactly what's happened here. The church, instead of being the religious leader of the people, has now become the follower of the people. And that's a sign that something is very much amiss in the church. Almost as important, the people are learning to practice religion without the church. They're learning that they can in fact have a satisfying religious life without the guidance of the church and without the spiritual leadership and comfort of the church. And that again is not a good sign for the institutional church. And as far as the Reformation is concerned, what it really means is that the great masses of the people are slowly separating themselves from the official church. And when Luther comes along with some really radically new ideas, he's not going to have to tear these people away from the church. They're already separated. They're just waiting for somebody to come along and provide them with a new direction.